Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. This morning, we awakened to the news that Iran held yet another military drill in the Gulf of Oman, in which they unveiled two new military warships, the missile launching Zara and the Macron, the Islamic regime's largest military ship, which comes equipped with its own helicopter launching pad. We all are aware of that last week, Iran announced that they would start enriching uranium to 20%, and they've threatened recently to enrich it to the 40 to 60% level. All of this making it an easy slide into the enrichment level of 90% purity, which is weapons-grade uranium. And last week, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps hijacked a South Korean flagship in the Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. had ordered our aircraft carrier, the USS Nimitz, to turn around from what was to be its naval exercises with the Indian Army and head back towards the Persian Gulf. The Iranians have already demanded that in order to sit down to the negotiating table with the United States, all sanctions first have to be lifted. And a story emerged in yesterday's U.S. News and World Report that Iran demands that we remove any snapback sanctions provision from any new nuclear negotiations. We are really in for a treat today because we are honored to have Richard Goldberg, who is a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. And Richard served as the director for counting Iranian weapons of mass destruction for the White House's National Security Council from 2019 to 2020. He also served as the chief of staff for Illinois Governor Bruce Reiner and the deputy chief of staff and senior forest policy advisor to former U.S. Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois. And I remember working with Richard way back when Senator Kirk was then Congressman Kirk, and I know that he is responsible for working on a wide range of issues related to U.S. foreign assistance, military financing, and he is most responsible as being the leading architect for the toughest sanction imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Senate. He was the lead Republican negotiator for 3 rounds of sanctions targeting the Central Bank of Iran, what's known as the SWIFT financial messaging service, and for targeting entire sections of the Iranian economy. So and he is also very responsible for promoting human rights and democracy in Iran, which is something that we at EMET work tirelessly on. So I feel that it is really a treat to have you here today, Richard, and I think that you are really an unsung American hero for keeping the United States and the free world as we know it safe from the hegemonic impulses of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So we'll begin now with my first question, and that is, do you believe that the bellicose behavior that we see the Iranian regime conducting recently is just posturing to get a better deal and immediate sanctions relief, or that the Iranians might actually be truly preparing for war? Richard.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me today, and thanks for joining what I hope is a great webinar. I look forward to your questions when we get to them. Up front, I think what we're seeing is an Iranian playbook that we've seen before. I'm from Chicago, so we know things about extortion rackets here. If anybody studied an extortion racket, this is a classic one where the Iranians find any way to try to threaten the West, threaten Washington, threaten Europe, threaten Israel, create political pressure and frenzy in the media that we might go to war, they might get nuclear weapons, they're going to do all these different things. Why are they doing that? Because they want to get paid. They want to get money to knock off some elements of the most fearful threats And by taking that money, they get to pour that into the coffers of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. They get to expand their march of imperialism through the Middle East, fund their conflicts, militias, terrorist organizations, whether it's in the West Bank and Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, form this Shia crescent, as they call it, throughout the Middle East that engulfs the state of Israel, that puts U.S. forces at risk, that endangers U.S. partners and allies, and also give them room to keep perfecting their longer and longer range missiles. Use that money to test, use that money to understand how they could someday target the continental United States, which remains their objective, and how they can keep their robust nuclear capabilities, their enrichment capabilities, their potential to revert to plutonium paths towards a bomb. Remember, the Iran nuclear deal was a temporary deal scoped only to the nuclear program, right? Excluding the missiles, excluding terrorism, excluding human rights abuses, all the other offenses we know about. And even inside that narrowly scoped deal with time limits, we still did not achieve a fundamental objective, which was to dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And so what we see today on the nuclear front is a consequence of the failure of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that we commonly call the Iran deal. Because we failed to force the regime to give up their capabilities, they retain the ability to threaten us with enrichment of uranium at any time of their choosing. We talk a lot about the sunsets of the deal. The 5 years out, the arms embargo was to fall off. That happened last October. 2023 missile restrictions and some centrifuge restrictions, 2025, more on enrichment, all the way to 2031. But in truth, because we let them keep all of the infrastructure intact, they had a sunset of their own, which was any time they wanted to use it. And we see that now when we reimpose sanctions, a decision to get out of the Iran nuclear deal, the United States, and reimpose our toughest sanctions to beat back their march throughout the Middle East, to squeeze the regime of resources for terrorism and missiles, proliferation, etc. What do they resort to? They resort to their age-old tactic of enriching uranium to get the money back. Well, so far, obviously, the Trump administration has not given in to that tactic. So they try other tactics. They try to threaten U.S. forces in Iraq. And the idea there is to try to have a little bit of distance and plausible deniability that this isn't us, this is some random Shia militia that's based in Iraq that's firing rockets at the U.S. Embassy compound, or that's rioting out front the U.S. Embassy and trying to storm the embassy. Now, late 2019 into early 2020, they miscalculated a little bit. They went a little too far, and the president responded, and that was the strike on Qassem Soleimani. And you haven't seen them sort of cross that Rubicon again. It's always sort of right below that red line of actually killing an American, causing harm, causing consternation, forcing the U.S. military to respond in a deterrence posture, which then produces news headlines that we might be on the brink of war. Again, creating a political atmosphere of we have to de-escalate. What does de-escalate mean? It's the word you're going to hear a lot of soon. It means sanctions relief. Again, see what they can do in the Gulf to try to go after U.S. allies to put pressure on the U.S. indirectly. We saw a missile strike against Saudi Arabia, against their oil production, cut off in a day 5% of the world's oil output. Didn't work for them. They thought they would spike the price of oil, create an international outrage. Didn't happen. The oil markets have changed so dramatically. And so they try again. They laid mines against different ships in the Gulf. Japan, others targeted, didn't work. They even seized a British vessel. Again, we didn't back down to the maximum pressure campaign. Now they've taken a South Korean vessel. Why South Korea? Well, there's a pot of money that the Iranians want access to that's sitting in South Korean banks. It belongs to the Central Bank of Iran, to the National Iranian Oil Company. It's that oil revenue. But because the Central Bank of Iran and the National Iranian Oil Company have been designated administration by the Treasury Department for their involvement in sponsorship of terrorism and their connections to the IRGC, no bank wants to process transactions for them, and they're not allowed to release the funds except for narrow humanitarian purposes. And so the Iranians are signaling to the incoming Biden administration, will tell you where the money is that we want access to immediately. It's in South Korea. It's almost a roadmap to sanctions relief for the incoming Biden team. And so one would hope that the incoming team would look at this and say, wow, this is a really desperate regime. The IMF has reported to us, based on the public estimates, right? We don't know the private estimates. The public estimates from the IMF are that Iran is now below $9 billion of accessible foreign exchange reserves. And we would have to expect that number has declined since that report a couple months ago. This regime is under enormous financial stress, and they're using different tactics that they have to appear stronger than they are right now, to try to appear that we're on a war footing, that this could all go bad. We're on a crisis. Maximum pressure has failed. Because if they can complete that narrative with allies in Washington who support the Iran deal, then right as they're at the brink, they will be rescued by sanctions relief. And again, you would think, even Tom Friedman, of all people, wrote in the New York Times, Mr. Biden, you're inheriting all this leverage. Why give it away if you want to try to accomplish something beyond the JCPOA, to extend limits out, to cover missiles, to cover terrorism? And we saw the response from the president-elect in the follow-on column that Tom Friedman printed, which was to say, I don't care about anything else. I'm just prioritizing the nuclear program, and I'm willing to go all the way back in and give all the sanctions relief. And it's a flawed premise on so many levels, and we can talk about several of them. Sanctions relief means money for terrorism. All of these institutions are now designated for their involvement in terrorism. And Congress doesn't support terrorism sanctions relief. They're on record, in fact, as recently as 2017, bipartisan during the Iran deal, almost unanimously voting to increase terrorism sanctions on Iran, on the IRGC. And yet, Central Bank of Iran, the oil company, the tanker company, the petrochemical company, so many more, we now have proven over the last couple of years are involved in terrorism. The sanctions are based on terrorism, not on the nuclear program. How do you give that sanctions back? How do you relieve the sanctions there and tell Congress, yeah, we're doing terrorism sanctions relief, but at least they're going back to an Iran deal that's already started to expire? Again, major flaw. Even if you believe somehow it was worth it in 2015, how could you believe that in 2020 when the sunsets are already kicking in? It makes no sense. President Barack Obama said that he could never have gotten Iran to the negotiating table to do as flawed and narrow a deal as the JCPOA without the sanctions we passed in Congress in 2011 and 2012. How on earth could Joe Biden imagine to do a better deal with less sanctions pressure than Barack Obama had? It makes no sense. One other point I'll make, and then look forward to more questions. We also have one other big difference that's gone on over the last 5 years. The nuclear archive. People don't talk about it, but it needs to be talked about. In 2015, we didn't know that Iran was concealing an entire curated museum of how to build a nuclear bomb and all the work they had done to date. We didn't know that the founder of the nuclear weapons program, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, that you may have heard about a couple months ago when he was assassinated, was still running an organization employing nuclear scientists who worked on the weapons program. That was revealed by the Treasury Department in 2019. And we didn't know, as we do now, that Iran is concealing undeclared nuclear material. The IAEA tells us they found environmental samples that tested positive at a warehouse that we saw Bibi Netanyahu at the UN reveal, and then saw satellite imagery of sanitization work. IAEA says they went there, they collected samples, and yeah, they came back positive for man-made, man-processed uranium. We then saw that there were some sites that were never declared, that the IAEA said, let us in. What are these sites? And we saw a whole fight in public last year where the Iranians said, no, we won't let you in. You don't have the ability to go here. They're based on this fabricated archive from the Israelis. And we believe, at least from the public reporting, that the IAEA did get access to at least one of those sites and maybe took more samples. So there's all these questions now about what Iran has concealed that we don't know about. And so the fundamental idea of the Iran deal was they're giving up their ambitions for nuclear weapons. They are telling us all the truth about their nuclear program, and we are going to constrict the nuclear program in exchange for all the sanctions relief. We now know that that's not even true. There's a whole world of things they haven't told us about. And if we don't verify that, if we don't get answers to that, the whole nuclear deal is a fabrication.
Wow, thank you, thank you. Do you believe, Rich, that the Biden administration understands and grasps the nature, or will understand and grasp the true nature of the regime, and that, you know, it is an ideology slash theocracy that wants supremacy, that they aim for hegemony, to use Samuel Huntington's term, that they want a clash of civilizations, that they believe that we in the West are decadent and that we need shared Islamism. Do you think that they grasp that at all?
So I think there are three camps, let's say, within that wider Biden team. And of course, as we've seen the list of nominations come forward, this is a recycle of the Obama foreign policy team, now just graduated to higher positions. And so having worked sometimes adversarially with them when I was on Capitol Hill and dialoguing behind the scenes with some of them, I put them sort of into three different camps. I think there's one camp that really just believes that this is a rational regime. It's all a put on, it's a charade. You can work with them. They're not actually extremists. They're not actually Islamic. They're not going to blow up the world. They just want a nuclear bomb because Israel has a nuclear bomb and Pakistan has a nuclear bomb. They'll never use it. Listen, they're in a region surrounded by missiles. Their acquisition of missiles makes sense for their own self-defense. The psyche of a country that went through the Iran-Iraq war. This is not a problem country. In fact, this is a potential ally. The potential ally in the war on the real threat of radical jihadi Sunni terrorism. And we were able to work with them and build a counter-ISIS coalition during the Iran nuclear deal. Hezbollah really proved to be a major asset to the United States in taking on ISIS in Syria. And so we need to reframe this. It's a prominent view. I would say like the Ben Rhodes type crowd are part of that view. And then you have sort of this middle section that says, yeah, it's a real problem, threat country. They are definitely a state sponsor of terrorism. We need to defend Israel. We need to defend ourselves. We have to be clear-eyed about these folks. But at the same time, we really got to avoid any conflict. War is bad. Avoid war at all costs. We can't be entrenched in this region. And it's not like the Sunni Arabs are much better with the jihadists that they have and that they've financed in the past. This is really a Sunni Shia fight going on. And if we can create some sort of a balance of power between the Sunni Arabs and the Shia theocracy, maybe it will sort of equal itself out, and we'll do a bunch of defensive things just to make sure if it all goes bad. That's really where the majority of people, I would say, are, and where you'll probably see the foreign policy go. And then I think there is, a smaller, sort of more hawkish, relatively piece of the puzzle that at least they were in the first term of the Obama administration, maybe not the second term. Maybe some of those will serve in this administration, that do see a major threat there, that don't see any equivalency with some of the Sunni Arab allies, that see a major emerging threat towards not just Israel, but the United States, but that fundamentally don't see any good options other than to find ways to kick the can until the supreme leader dies and see what happens next. And that was an argument that was given to me by people who I really respected, who were in the Obama White House after they left, of why they came out ultimately to be okay with the JCPOA and against some of the legislation we were pushing into Congress. It was, he's got cancer, if this gets us 5 years to see if he dies and then see what shakes out, it's worth it to me because everything else is a bad option. Now, I don't agree with all three camps fundamentally, but I think that that's where they are. And again, I think that middle one is where you're going to see them go.
Right, and October 18th, we saw how kicking the can down the road just doesn't work. These sanctions expire. There's so many sunset clauses. So do you believe at this point that we can sit down and negotiate a better deal in the JCPOA?
So it is possible to negotiate a better deal from a position of strength if the regime is desperate enough and close enough to collapse that they have no other choice, which was the premise of the maximum pressure campaign and still sort of the premise strategy of how to maintain your leverage, try to bring allies back into the U.S. camp, and then approach Iran from a position of unified strength. To me, it's rather impossible to imagine any other quote-unquote better deal, let alone return to the same flawed deal if we give back sanctions relief. Iran may have an incentive, by the way, not to go back to the full deal so quickly. They benefit from the JCPOA framework existing, the Security Council resolution being recognized that govern the JCPOA. Remember, we had this big snapback fight late last summer into the fall, where the U.S. claimed it was snapping back. Everybody else said we don't recognize it. The Iranians are sort of having their nuclear cake and enriching it too, where they're in complete violation of the JCPOA, but they're still on track to get all the sunsets because the UN security resolution is still recognized. And that's their sweet spot. So if they just need a few $1 billion to hang on a couple more years to get to the next sunset, why open yourself up to a negotiation beyond the JCPOA? If you see a desperate administration that wants to negotiate with you, then perhaps offer something less for something less, where you don't go all the way back into the JCPOA. That's still what you're negotiating towards, so that you put off any snapback at the UN Security Council. But you get a few $1 billion and you say, okay, well, we'll stop the 20% enrichment, or we'll just stop enriching and we'll keep the stockpile for now, or we'll downblend this much kilograms of enriched uranium in exchange for this much money. And then you get the Biden folks sucked into this never-ending negotiation where you're negotiating against yourself while the clock is ticking on the existing framework. And so hopefully that will be rejected outright. There are people in Washington, reasonable people, who are already calling for that. It's called less for less. As a concept to get incremental confidence building measures to negotiation. To me, I think that is quicksand to losing our leverage and giving Iran everything it wants.
All right. What kind of leverage does the United States have if they acquiesce to the demand for immediate sanctions relief? Is there any leverage?
None.
No.
Two reasons why. One is strategic and one is just the practical implication of sanctions relief. On a strategic level, if you are the Iranians and you see an incoming administration afraid just because you're enriching uranium, and they're so afraid they are willing to give you back all your sanctions relief if you'll just stop enriching uranium. But the commitment is that we're going to be in a process to negotiate some sort of better deal once we're back in the deal. And when you get questioned, well, where's your leverage? What you see them say today is, oh, we have leverage because we could always reimpose the sanctions again if they don't negotiate in good faith. And the Iranians now have seen that the U.S. can reimpose sanctions on its own. And this is a very smart tactical play by the Biden team. Sorry, slip of the tongue there. They will tell you, we were wrong about one thing. Apparently, the U.S. can reimpose sanctions unilaterally. We said it couldn't be done before Trump pulled out of the deal. We wrote a lot of op-eds saying you can't do this without Europe, without China, without Russia. Okay, we were wrong about that. Apparently, the U.S. can bring a lot of pressure on its own because of the way our sanctions work. We didn't realize that. So that's our leverage. The Iranians fearing that Biden will do what Trump did and reimpose the sanctions. But think about that. If you are saying today that we're afraid of you enriching uranium, so we will relieve the sanctions immediately so long as you don't enrich. And that's the tactic that Iran now knows causes fear in the Biden team. Then if you were to threaten to reimpose sanctions, wouldn't you expect that Iran would simply threaten to start enriching again? Because they still have the capability to, which means it's a false hope of reimposition of sanctions. It's never going to happen. It's a false promise. So that's the strategic picture. One other strategic picture is that, you're also sort of saying, we don't have a bottom line of the United States of America. We are so afraid of you enriching uranium that we will just try to pay you to stop, because we will never resort to military action if you go too far. That's the underlying thing that's really going on here, which is very strategically dangerous for the United States. It's very important we always maintain a credible military option, that Iran really believes that there is some sort of red line, even if they can't tell exactly what it is, that a US president is willing to use military force to stop them from acquiring nuclear weapons, period. Barack Obama made that promise. Don't believe the Iranians believe that certainly by the end of the Obama administration. Donald Trump has made that promise repeatedly. I think they do fear that, especially after the Soleimani killing. What will they think of Joe Biden if he doesn't put that on the table and he immediately retreats in the face of enrichment? So you're not only showing them that we fear enrichment and will never reimpose sanctions, you're also hinting that we may not have any sort of military bottom line, which is a big green light to do things on the clandestine side, which is a big problem as well.
Wonderful. Okay. On that sanguine note, I'm going to turn the podium over to our wonderful Director of Communications, Saleha Thompson, to read the questions that have come in.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Richard, for all of your insights so far, and to everybody who has submitted questions. We'll get through as many as we can. So the first question we have, if 90% enriched uranium is considered military grade, then why does it make a difference to us if Iran enriches uranium at a 20, 40, or 60% grade? Aren't they all relatively the same to us?
So there's different levels that take a different amount of time to master, as far as how long it takes to enrich, how long it takes to get it right, to get to that enrichment level, because fundamentally you're dealing with a series of centrifuges. So think about a laboratory centrifuge. This is something that spins, really, really fast. And in this case, it's spinning uranium. And you have to do a series of these centrifuges, one by one, fed into the next, where you're spinning into one, you're spinning into the next. And these are what we call cascades of centrifuges. And you got to figure out this design just right, of how do you get this purity level of enriched uranium up towards the weapons grade. And the initial sort of period of getting your some of this very low enriched uranium, obviously from natural uranium into a low enriched uranium, into a little bit higher low enriched uranium grade, that is the sort of area where it takes a while. You make a lot of mistakes, a lot of trial and error. And once you start getting up to 20%, which is considered high enriched uranium, the time it takes to further enrich from that level of purity up to the weapons grade is a lot shorter than the time it takes to go from your baseline. And so that is why a lot of people look at something called a breakout timeline, which is the time it would take to enrich enough fissile material to weapons grade to have enough to have one nuclear device. Now, this is just the enrichment piece of it. Obviously, you need a device as well. And, we lack a lot of public reporting on where they may be on that, outside of some of the research that's been done by Andrea Stricker at FDD, David Albright at the Good ISIS, and others about the nuclear archive. And we can sort of glean from some of that material, perhaps, in the public record, what work they might have been doing in the past. But ultimately, they could also opt for a crude device, right? It might not be that they're trying to put something on a missile first. They just want something to go boom out in the desert, right? They want to have a fizz the way North Korea did to say, hey, we're a nuclear power. And so that's why we fear the amount of their stockpile and what level they're at and how quickly they could get to weapons grade. Now, obviously, this is, again, all in the full view, at least today, of the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's how we know that they have this enrichment going on. They're declaring it. They want us to know. The part where you would get afraid is if there's something going on that you don't know about. or if ever they kick out inspectors, or if there's a period of time of delayed inspections where they try to divert material away from a declared site somewhere else that we don't know about today, that they're preparing for some other sort of weaponization work. So it is concerning. We have to be concerned about it. We have to send clear messages that we're going to be watching intensely, that we will take military action if necessary to prevent them from actually going to the next step. But relieving sanctions in response sends the opposite message, as I've said. It just tells them they have the leverage, they're in the driver's seat, we're afraid, we won't use military action to stop them from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And now they can go take all that money out for a spin in terms of terrorism, missiles, whatever else they want to do to terrorize the region.
Right. Thank you so much for that. The next question we have, how much stronger is Iran now than it was in 2015? And we were told that we would almost go after them, I guess we being the United States, if they didn't comply.
So I believe that Iran is strategically weaker today than they were in 2015. They do not have the billions upon billions of dollars that they had coming out of the nuclear deal, and really January 2016, the implementation of the JCPOA starting. There's no real foreign direct investment to speak of. There's no deals going on. Their export of oil has sunk to record lows. Their access to the revenue of whatever oil they're getting is very hard to come by. The budgets for the defense have been going down steadily. The budget for the IRGC has gone down steadily. The budgets for their terror proxies has gone down. We've seen the reports of the tzedakah boxes, so to speak, that Hezbollah has been putting out. And so that's all very good news for U.S. national security. Now, does it cost a lot of money to take some of these missile parts and move them into Yemen or into Iraq or into Syria? No, they can still do that if they prioritize that kind of malign activity over their people. And unfortunately, that's the regime we're dealing with. Can they still test some missiles? Yes, they could test missiles. They have tried to do so throughout this period as well. As we've seen, as the president tweeted famously, it hasn't always worked out for them. So they continue to waste money on some of these failed missile tests. But yes, they can continue to do that. Because we left them with their nuclear infrastructure, can they take their centrifuges out of mothball and start enriching uranium if that's what they want to do? Yes, they can do that. But that doesn't mean that the fundamentals of their economy aren't on their last legs. We saw them cut subsidies for gasoline, which sparked nationwide riots in 2019. Probably one of the closest points we've seen to real instability for that regime, and they knew it. So we saw them shut down the internet for days, mass arrests, etc. At some point, they're going to have to take another one of those steps, which could, again, incite a lot of instability. They know that. They're putting that off as much as possible. This is as much a show for the market and for the exchange houses and the psychology inside the country to buy more time to say, no, Biden's coming, sanctions relief is probably on the way, we're going to hold this together. But I think their economy at this point is likely a house of cards. And if you didn't go in the direction that the market now expects, which is sanctions relief, you would see enormous additional pressure come to bear, and you would see a very different outcome of the Iranians asking for negotiations more on our terms.
Thank you. The next question we have, critics will say that the maximum pressure campaign, while hurting Iran's economy, as you're saying, hasn't achieved its main goal of getting Iran to the negotiating table and stopping their nuclear activity. What would and should have been the next steps to reach these goals?
So unfortunately, it took a long time for the maximum pressure campaign to ramp up. And so it's not like this was 4 years of a maximum pressure campaign and it didn't work. I mean, if you listen to the rhetoric of the other side, that's what they're saying. Oh, 4 years, failed Iran policy, we're worse off, the nuclear program is expanded, let's go back to the Iran deal. Well, I'm sorry, that's just revisionist history. 2017, we were in the Iran deal all year. It wasn't until 2018, May, that the president decided to leave the Iran deal. It wasn't until November that he reimposed the first major sanctions. And unfortunately, that November, we issued major waivers for their oil exports. So all we did was bring them back to the pressure of pre-JCPOA. We brought them back to where basically the Obama administration had put them before they opened talks. And remember, the Obama administration was benefiting from our sanctions built up from 2010 in CISADA, late 2011 into 2012 in the central bank sanctions, 2012 in the SWIFT cutoff of the banks, and then that early 2013 period where sectors of the economy were finally under sanctions. It was only then that they got to the interim deal. And that's several years of sustained maximum pressure increasing. We didn't cut off oil waivers until May 2019. We didn't even hit the full financial sector until just a couple months ago. It took until January of last year to hit major sectors of the economy, metals, mining, and manufacturing. So there were a lot of things that could have been done earlier. There are reasons why they weren't. Every administration has some differing views. But we are finally at that point where we have really fired all the arrows. It's only a few months old of sustained maximum pressure. But the market's already sort of collapsing around it, expecting the Biden administration to relieve sanctions. You're going to see more evasion going on, probably a lack of enforcement. And so it is this incredible, unfortunate coincidence that the maximum pressure campaign is peaking right at the transition of power. And so had there been another term of sustained maximum pressure, there would be a very different outcome likely in the next few months. We will see if the incoming Biden team, after they get full briefings on the state of the Iranian economy and the state of the programs and what's going on, say to themselves, actually, we really should sort of take our time. Maybe we will send messages of we want to negotiate, and we'll finally drag them along instead of them dragging us along, and see how long we can hold out with sustained pressure while saying we want to negotiate, and see how long they can hold out.
Thank you. The next question we have, are you at all optimistic that incoming Secretary of State Blinken will take a fresh approach and not default back to the failed Kerry template?
So I think Tony Blinken is his own person. He's very smart. I respect him. But he also is part of a team that put together the Iran nuclear deal, fundamentally. And they believe in it. And they've talked about going back in. And more importantly, the person he works for, the president-elect, has made clear his goal is to go back in. And Jake Sullivan, the incoming national security advisor, repeated that at a Wall Street Journal conference. So they have a declared policy. Now, the tension, I think, is that he has a different declared commitment during the campaign. And that is, if people remember, Jewish Insider did a big interview with Tony Blinken, maybe October. And he said, we will not relieve sanctions for non-nuclear areas of concern. We will continue non-nuclear sanctions. Now, that was a term of art that the Obama team had come up with, that all of the sanctions relief in the JCPOA were nuclear sanctions, even though we knew that it was going to subsidize terrorism. Well, it's a little harder to play that game now because, as I said, the central bank, the National Iranian Oil Company, the tanker company, all these major institutions are designated specifically for terrorism. They're just under sanctions from Congress, and it's for a bunch of reasons. We have current conduct evidence that the Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice signed off on to be able to defend in court, saying they're tied to terrorism right now. And so this contradiction of we are going to go back into the deal, but we won't relieve terrorism sanctions, is about to blow up. And I think if there were an opportunity for a bipartisan approach going forward, knowing that Congress overwhelmingly voted for CATSA in 2017, all the IRGC terrorism sanctions in that bill, that maybe we say, we'll go back in, but you can't relieve any terrorism sanctions. And if the Iranians are upset with that because they think that's not part of the deal, that that's somehow a violation of the deal, well, we're allowed to impose sanctions for non-nuclear reasons. And that'll be our interpretation of the deal. That would be a very interesting change of policy, and one that could actually win bipartisan support. So you keep central bank sanctions, you keep oil sanctions, anything that's tied to the IRGC and terrorism, you keep. And if it's tied to missiles specifically, not the nuclear program, you keep, right? Human rights sanctions, you keep. And nuclear-related sanctions, truly, we will negotiate for nuclear concessions. There are strategic arguments against that approach because all money is fungible, but at least you could actually have a pretty good conversation, I think, bipartisan, of what that means if we sustain pressure, we sustain terrorism sanctions until terrorism ends, not just a nuclear concession. That could win bipartisan support, I think.
Thank you. The next question we have, how does the Israeli threat of taking military action against Iran's nuclear infrastructure factor into Iran's calculations?
So it's a big factor. They have to calculate it in always. I think the Abraham Accords also get their antenna into super paranoia mode because now you have to sort of figure out, before we were always sort of talking about this long range strike where how long could Israel sustain it for? Do they have air-to-air refueling capabilities? You know, are they going to have to like drop one munition, go all the way back to Israel, come all the way back? How is this going to work? You had clandestine reports leaking out into media before the JCPOA. I remember there was one article of Azerbaijan was going to let a big desert runway, be used by the Israelis if they struck Iran, and they were doing all these different testing. And well, now you actually have normalization agreements with Arab countries right next door that have military bases in their country. And so you do have to sort of wonder, if you're the Iranians, could a sustained attack be coming by the Israelis via an air base that's nearby where they can keep refueling on the ground repeatedly without having to rely on air-to-air refueling. So that will be a big factor. Now, it will also be balanced by whether or not we see constraints come from the new administration. Right now, we're in a sort of a moment where we saw the news of additional Syria strikes last night by the Israelis, allegedly. Central Command under the Trump administration has given close coordination, intelligence sharing, full support, essentially subcontracting a military effort against Iranian proxies in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, reportedly perhaps in Iraq, maybe elsewhere. And if Central Command under a new administration comes and says, this is hostile, it's terrible, knock it off, we're not going to allow it, we own the airspace, we're not going to be in conflict with you, we're not sharing intelligence with you anymore, that will send a very different message to the Iranians that the Israelis are being constrained by the United States, and will have a political calculation that they may not want to take in launching any strike. So I think it's something that has to be talked about. It certainly drove a lot of conversations before the Iran deal. The Europeans went crazy over the thought that that might happen. Israel is a sovereign nation, independent. They're going to have to do what they want to do, whether the United States supports it or not at some point. So yes, I mean, to a space to watch, but also a space where if the Biden administration is smart and wants to build some goodwill in the region and some goodwill on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, will continue Central Command's relationship with the IAF when it comes to Iranian proxies outside of Iranian borders.
Thank you. Our next question, given that Iran has run a clandestine nuclear weapons program since the late 1980s and never permitted inspection at both known and unknown sites, what confidence could we ever have that we fully know where they are in enrichment, warhead development, etc.? As you mentioned, that there might not be sharing everything that's going on.
Yeah, it's difficult to answer that question. You don't know everything you don't know, and you have to assume that. But you have to make assessments based on what you do know, what you have access to, what you can compare things to. You have to find what we call indications and warnings in the intelligence community and try to make predictive benchmarks of, if we see this, it might be indicative of that. In the end, you hope and pray that your intelligence apparatus combined with Israel's intelligence apparatus, combined with anybody else in the world that has one, can put together a combined picture where we can see at least what the gaps are, and then what should we be worrying about that we don't know about, and how can we try to find ways to fill in the gaps and answer these questions. But this is a real challenge for any intelligence community. You don't want to overstate a problem, and you also don't want to get caught understating a problem. And there are times in our history where we've missed things, and it's quite possible to do so, which is why fundamentally the archive is a major game changer, because we get to study a whole lot of information about what they were working on, what they might still be working on, who was involved, how did they do it, what were their approaches, did they make mistakes, did they learn from their mistakes, where would they have gone next, where should we be looking, and then to have these questions being pursued by the IAEA vigorously is essential to keep the Iranians up against the wall, to know that there's inspectors coming every day somewhere, that they're looking, and that if they get caught, it's all over for their gambit, that the whole world will come down on them if they get caught hiding something very dangerous, imminent, problematic. And I think it's a cat and mouse game that they're playing with us. And we just have to continue being very proactive in looking and asking questions and raising concerns. I'll note there that one of the big failures of the Obama administration to get the Iran nuclear deal was pressuring the IAEA to close the file on their past weapons work, and to say, yeah, they never answered all the questions we had, but it's okay. We have a nuclear deal now. Let's close the file. Let's let it go away. And they did. They took it off the agenda. We can't let that happen again now that we have seen the archive and all this new information come to light. There will be a temptation for those who want to try to preserve the nuclear deal to say that's a distraction. It's a threat. It might undermine the deal. Let's make these questions go away again. And if the Biden administration does that, that is a tremendous fundamental failure for U.S. national security, because it takes that pressure off for this important issue.
Thank you. The next question we have on the vein of intelligence: would the U.S. know if North Korea were to transfer nuclear weapons to Iran?
Again, there is public reporting in the past about the levels of cooperation and coordination between Iran and North Korea. It's something we've always been concerned about and watched for, whether there's nuclear cooperation. There's obviously known past missile cooperation. There's a lot of these random reports that emerge of an Iranian who showed up at a nuclear test in North Korea, or a North Korean who showed up in Iran. That has to be something we tier as a high level of concern to be watchful of. And if there was ever clear, convincing evidence of something going on, we would need to take urgent action in that space. I'll leave it there because obviously it's a sensitive space, but it's a concern. We need to watch it. And I'll say not just that, but our policies in these two spaces also can't exist in vacuums. It's so interesting to me that in the presidential debate, Joe Biden advocated maximum pressure on North Korea. I don't know if I remember that. It kind of got lost. But his North Korea policy in criticizing Trump for diplomacy was, we need to keep the sanctions pressure on until we get concessions and a fully denuclearized Korean peninsula. That was his comment. He had to clean it up a little bit because he offended South Korea, but that was his comment. I thought to myself, he just described maximum pressure on Iran, while he's in favor of relieving the sanctions and not getting denuclearization in Iran. And so those two actors definitely watch U.S. policy, and one has to believe that they play off each other. And if there's an opening on one end, why wouldn't the other say, well, I want that deal too? Why would North Korea want a JCPOA if we're giving it to Iran? So in that respect, we need to be consistent in our counter WMD policies and our sanctions policies across the board.
Very interesting. Thank you. The next question we have: why hasn't any administration ever funded regime change? There is obviously a significant plurality of Iranians who are very unhappy with the Ayatollahs. So wouldn't it take relatively little to catalyze civil strife on a massive scale?
Yeah, so regime change is a loaded term because of the Iraq War. And so in the post-Iraq War era, there has been an aversion to any attempts to foment regime change, particularly in the Middle East, where you would have to have a presidential finding, from the president saying, I have a policy of actual regime change, and you are authorized to take any steps necessary to execute that policy, obviously short of military action. We essentially today have a policy of regime collapse or negotiate. And so in that respect, our policy, sort of implies that if they don't negotiate, we are comfortable with the regime collapsing. And we still find that to be a good outcome for U.S. national security, which I agree with. And so is there space in that to think forward about supporting the people of Iran in their yearning for a democratic or some sort of post-Islamic Republic, peaceful, democratic, institutionalized country that respects everyone and brings minorities, whether you're a Persian or you're an Azeri or you're an Arab or you're Baha'i or whoever you are, that everyone's treated with respect and dignity and has a voice in the government. Yeah, there are things we should be doing. We were doing that in the Congress for years. We had funding for that during the Bush administration years, directly out of the Appropriations Committee. It was called Iran Democracy. And we appropriated millions of dollars for that. It was difficult to find grantees, though, who wanted to take money that was labeled Iran Democracy, because if they were inside Iran and they took the U.S. money, obviously that's problematic in that regime. But there are channels that we should use to help people communicate together. Technology that needs to get out there. How do they get around the censorship of apps and internet and whatnot? I will say there's also, to me, a need for real thinking on what does a post-Islamic Republic look like? I think it's very difficult in our political environment to wrap your head around being for the collapse of a regime when you don't know what comes next, right? Is it going to be an IRGC regime that just steps in and it's a traditional military junta? Is it going to devolve into civil strife like we saw in Iraq? Are we going to see terrorists emerge? Who's going to get the weapons? Or is this going to be a monarchy, as some have advocated? Is it going to be a true democracy? What is this, and who are the leaders? Hard for people to stand up and say, I'm a leader, because you're going to get killed immediately. So I think that as Americans, if we had some real credible ideas out there of what a post-Islamic Republic looks like, that makes a lot of sense, that, this is what it could look like, here's how it would happen, here are the downsides, here are the upsides, here are a couple of alternative paths that could happen. I think you then could have a conversation about, again, increasing support for the Iranian people, not by military means, but by everything else, and be comfortable with this idea of removing this horrible terror-sponsoring regime, not by our hands, but by the people's hands. And understanding where that could go in a positive direction for the region and for the world.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, which is, where's the red line, or at what point do we here in the US or in Israel say enough is enough and proceed with taking some degree of military action against the nuclear facilities, if ever?
Yeah, I think that it's important to set a clear red line. The president has set one in terms of more of the terrorism realm, that if a U.S. person is targeted or killed, that he would respond militarily. That's what prompted the Soleimani strike. I think we need a similar type red line for the nuclear realm as well, whether that is a level of enrichment, whether that is a size of the stockpile, or whether we want to keep it vague and talk about some sort of all-encompassing if we see steps towards nuclear weapons, and keep the Iranians sort of on their back heels wondering, well, what does that include? Some might think that that's actually better than being very specific. You know, you recall Netanyahu with his caricatured bomb, and he drew the line at the UN some years ago. That's a very specific red line and a very specific area of conduct. They might think that as long as they don't do that publicly and they do something else, it might not prompt a strike. Perhaps we need multiple different things that would prompt a strike. Perhaps we already do as a government and they don't know about it. And maybe that's a good thing. So yes, we have to have a bottom line. You have to have the leader of the country, president, saying repeatedly, I will use military force. You need a bipartisan consensus in the Congress to show that there is political will to back up that president to use military force if necessary, key word. But where you draw that line, I think, is something that could be helpful in the public debate, because at least puts the idea of a military strike in the back of their minds. Whether you are specific or vague, I think could also be subject to debate based on what we think their calculation would be.
Wonderful. Richard, I can't thank you enough for your huge arsenal of wisdom, particularly about the Iranian problem, and your intellectual honesty and moral courage to say the right things and to advocate for really wonderful policies that we've had up until today. Please tune in next week, because we are going to hear the view from Israel of the same problem from Ephraim Imbar from the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, who just wrote a rather brilliant paper talking about how he believes, because of messages that have been telegraphed from the United States and certainly from the Biden campaign of retrenchment, retreat, and isolationism, that he believes that it is really going to be up to, unfortunately, Israel to be able to react with military force if certain red lines are passed. And I would like to say, please, if anybody would like to support the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, it's an excellent think tank. And please remember to support EMET. We believe very, very strongly that a well-informed public eventually leads to very good policy decisions. And that's why we have these weekly webinars. And again, thank you so much, Richard, for your treasure trove of wisdom that you've shared with us today.
Thanks for having me.